Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in today. So today we're going to be talking about the life of St Guthlac of Crowland. So this is a pre-schism Western saint over in England. Specifically, he's an Anglo-Saxon saint rather than like a Welsh saint or something like that. And we're going to be covering a bit of a deep cut with regards to his life, I guess you could say. So instead of talking about the more famous and probably more influential life of St. Guthlac, the Latin version that was produced shortly after his death, we're instead going to be talking about an Old English poem called The Life of St. Guthlac of Crowland, or more commonly in academic terms, it's called Guthlac A, because in the collection that it's in this sort of book that has all these different stories written down, in what's called the Exeter book, there's also Guthlac B that follows right after it, and they're a bit different. So in order to distinguish, there's Guthlac A and Guthlac B. So we're talking about Guthlac A. And I guess before we get too much into this, I want to give out some dates. St. Guthlac's life ranges from about 674 to 714. Of course, this is AD. And then within a few decades afterwards, probably somewhere between like 15 to 25 years afterwards, after he dies, the Latin life of St. Guthlac is written. So this would be about 730 to 740 AD. And then there is actually an Old English translation of the Latin life, which probably dates from about 1050. That's at least when the manuscript that we have of it is found, but it might be a bit earlier. And then with regards to Guthlac A, which we're going to be talking about, it probably is somewhere around the mid to late 900s, you could say, but it might be a bit earlier. There might be earlier versions that we don't have, or earlier, oral versions of the story, things like that. So dating this is kind of hard, but somewhere around the 900s is probably a safe bet. So, as I said, there's Guthlac A and Guthlac B. So Guthlac B, and they're both like these Old English Anglo-Saxon poems. So Guthlac B focuses on the saint's death, and it draws quite heavily from the Latin life. But there is debate if Guthlac A does. It seems it doesn't, at least not directly, and that seems to be the majority opinion among scholars, and I tend to agree with that. But what it seems like is happening is that it takes from an oral tradition that maybe both the poem and the Latin life are taken from, because there's certain similarities to the Latin life, but only in very broad strokes, and a lot of like key details from the Latin life aren't really included in Guthlac A. But there is also a case you can make that it actually does draw on the Latin life. However, the differences can be explained due to differences in the genres that the Latin life and this Anglo-Saxon poem are in. So just maybe the differences in the genre causes it to seem like there really isn't any direct connection to the Latin life. However, I'm a bit skeptical about that, because we have Guthlac B, which very obviously draws from the Latin life, and it's kind of in a similar genre. They're both like Old English, Anglo-Saxon poetry. So I don't know if I completely buy that, but that is a possible argument. But either way, I'm not really too concerned about that. But what I do want to do before we get into this poem is talk about St. Guthlac's life as a broad overview, because the poem assumes the reader really already has an understanding and is familiar with the life of St. Guthlac. At times, it seems to mention certain episodes in his life, which you're just supposed to know what it's talking about. And so before we go into this, I think we should go into a little bit of the overview of the Latin life of St. Guthlac, and just get some broad details kind of fleshed out before we go into the poem itself. So, as I said earlier, St. Guthlac, he's born in the late 7th century, probably around 674 AD, to a noble Anglo-Saxon family, specifically from the kingdom of Mercia. So this is after the Anglo-Saxons, which is the tribes from Germany, like the Angles, the Saxons, and the Utes. After they arrived to England in the early 5th century, and they established these various kingdoms in what is now called like England, and the Kingdom of Mercia, which is the where St Guthlac hails from. It's the largest of these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and at the time, they're constantly warring against the Britons, specifically in Wales. So this means like they're fighting against like the Celtic peoples, who were there when they arrived in England. So St Guthlac is born into a royal family. He's baptized, all that stuff. However, after a while, he gets kind of tired and he gets kind of bored, and he decides that he wants to start a warband to, achieve glory. So he starts warring against the Welsh, and then after a while, though, specifically after reading the lives of various saints, specifically the lives of these hermit saints, he starts to meditate on death. He looks around, he sees all of his success, at least in an earthly sense, but he starts to ponder if there's really any meaning to what he's doing. And then after some thinking, he decides that he wants to devote his life to Christ in a monastery. So he goes to the monastery in Repton. So this monastery, it's about, using modern English cities, it's about like 37 miles northeast of Birmingham, or about 25 miles west of Nottingham, just to kind of give you a sense of where it's at. So kind of like northeast England. And he goes to the monastery in Repton. So this monastery is a double monastery, which means that there's both like there's nuns and there's monks, and it's led by an abbess. So when you read the Latin Life, it says that he was tonsured by an abbess, which might be a bit weird, to us. Well, why is like an abbess doing this? But it was a double monastery. The story then goes on to talk about how he became one of the greatest of all the monks. However, he still wanted to advance in the spiritual life. So he does what a lot of monastics have done, which is he wanted to be a hermit. And specifically, he wanted to go out into the wilderness, out into the desert. But England doesn't really have deserts, as like the sandy place. So instead, he goes to the fens, which is this marshy, swampy, I guess, boggish area in northeast England, which in terms of a sacred geography, it has a very similar role to the way that the Egyptian desert or the Russian tundra had for monks in Russia and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And what I mean by that is it's this wilderness, it's this uncivilized place. It's very hard to grow anything. It's hard to cultivate the land there, as well as, and most importantly, it's haunted by demons. So the fens in Anglo-Saxon lore and Anglo-Saxon stories, they're often talked about as hosting demons, hosting these monsters. For instance, Grendel and Grendel's mother are said to live in the fens. It does not, of course, it's not specifically talking about the fens in England. However, it's just using fens as a general term, living in these marshy, swampy areas. So in the Anglo-Saxon imagination, the fens are these places where these monsters and demons reside in. So St. Guthlac, he's going straight into the heart of where the demons are, and he's going to live a hermetic lifestyle. And then the Latin Life talks about, various temptations that he has, various stories that happen, within the fens, living that hermetic life, meeting other people come into him, and things like that. Then he dies and goes to heaven. Of course, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, but that's just because I want to give you the broad overview of the story. Because, as I said, this Old English poem assumes you kind of have a broad outline. So I think that'll be good enough, and we can kind of jump into now talking about the poem. I was having a bit of trouble, initially at least, describing this poem or kind of translating this poem into like a podcast form for a couple of reasons. One, it's not strictly linear, as we'll see, and I'll go into it more. Another is that we have a poem which has certain poetic qualities which don't necessarily translate well to being just summarized. So I don't think I can translate the poetic qualities of this poem, at least completely, to you guys. Rather, I decided that I'm going to focus on 4 things to entice you to want to read this poem. So the first is that there's a chiastic structure to this poem. So for those of you who don't know what a chiasm is, or a chiastic structure, it's when the beginning and the end correlate, the second to last correlate, and the third to last correlate, so on and so forth. And normally there's some middle point where there's a sort of culmination or a sort of high point in the story, I guess you could say. So there's the chiastic structure I want to emphasize. Then there is seeing this poem as wisdom literature. And I think this really is the proper way to view this poem. You have to see it as like a form of like Anglo-Saxon wisdom literature in a poetic form. Really what it reminds me of is if you've ever read 4th Maccabees, which is in some Bibles, some biblical canons in the East, but not a lot. And even when it is included, it's often included as like an appendix or something. And what 4th Maccabees does is it's really a commentary on 2nd Maccabees. So 2nd Maccabees is where we learn about the Maccabean martyrs and Eleazar, and those who refuse to eat pork and worship idols from the Greeks. So 4th Maccabees comments on 2nd Maccabees, and it uses it in a form of like wisdom literature. So it relates these stories from 2nd Maccabees and kind of expounds upon them a bit, and then tries to make a point with regards to like wisdom and knowledge and some other themes. So I think you can see this poem in the same light, where it's taking the story of St. Guthlac, whether it's some oral tradition or it's from the Latin life of St. Guthlac, doesn't really matter. It's taking the life of St. Guthlac, which it really assumes that you know a lot about the life already, and it's trying to tell you things you can learn from it. And now the third theme that I want to emphasize is the theme of wandering and exile. So this is quite a common trope that you see in Anglo-Saxon poetry. For instance, like there's the famous Old English poetry, The Wanderer, which I remember I had to read that in like high school or like college or something. This idea of homelessness and trying to find your place or have a home in the world is a thing that crops up quite a lot in Anglo-Saxon poetry. So I want to talk about that. As well as the last thing I really want to emphasize is going to be how the poem is constantly talking about how God has control over the demons. The demons aren't really in control. They only have power to the extent that God allows them to have any power. And then just a quick note I want to make. So throughout this analysis, I'm going to be talking about specific translations of Anglo-Saxon words. But just a note, I have not formally studied Old English, and I'm really just using various dictionaries that I have found to try to get the meaning. So I'm not going to do too much like translation analysis. However, I will do a little bit because I think that it will help our analysis in some parts. So I think we can get into this poem now. We can start with what's called the general prologue. And this general prologue is actually, it's contested whether or not it properly belongs to this Guthlac poem. Some people have argued that it belongs to the poem that precedes this in the manuscript in the Exeter book, which is about like the final judgment. But they have really bad reasons for doing that, frankly. And unfortunately, many translations of this poem that you can find, they don't have like the first 18 or 19 or so lines of this poem. But the one I'm using does have it, thankfully. But there's a couple problems with why people contest it. So first off, there's quite a bit of spacing between the prologue and the previous poem, as well as there's like a large capital letter that starts out this prologue, which it seems to indicate it's the beginning of something new. And then lastly, the general prologue, it's very it flows very well with the poem. Like it seems too good to just be accidentally there. It seems to be very intentional. That's part of the Guthlac poem. And now I'll give a general outline to how this poem goes, at least story-wise. So there is the general prologue, which I just outlined or talked about a little bit. Then there's the specific prologue. Then there's the sort of background to St. Guthlac's life. And then there's him going to the wilderness to live a hermetic life. And he has various temptations that occur there. And then there's the descent into hell. And then there's the return to earth and the sort of his victory on earth. And then there's his ascent into heaven. So the chiastic structure is heaven at the beginning and the end. Now going one ring in, it's earth. And then in the middle, there's the descent into hell. So I'm going to read y'all the first 10 lines of the poem. There shall be the fairest of joys when they meet at the beginning, an angel and a blessed soul, when she gives up this earthly joy and forsakes these loaned pleasures, when she is parted from her body. Then the angel speaks, keeping the elder order, and one spirit greets the other and announces God's embassy. Now you may venture to where you have striven for a long time, again and again, and I shall lead you myself, For you the ways will be pleasant, and revealed is the splendorous light of glory. You are now a fated farer, on your way to the holy home. What this describes, and there's more to the prologue, but I'm just going to read this for now. What we have is an earthly person, a saint who goes up into heaven. And it says, I want to make a note here, when it says they meet at the beginning, the word beginning can also mean like eternity or creation. So I think a better translation would be like, when they meet in eternity. So this is the start of our chiasm. This is heaven. So we're going to start in heaven, and then at the end of the poem, we're also going to end up in heaven. So the beginning and the end are going to be, in some sense, the same. I also want to point out in these first 10 lines is that we already have this theme of exile and wandering that I've been talking about. So it says, now you may venture to where you have striven for a long time. And then it says a little bit later, you are now a fated farer on your way to the holy home. So there's this sense that we get that being on earth is, in some way, it's a sense of exile. And that our goal is to make our way home to the heavenly home, right? So it's taking up these Anglo-Saxon ideals of exile, which is normally seen as a very bad thing. And it says, yes, while we may be in some sense in exile here on earth, we do have a holy home, which we know we can reach if we live a holy life and follow God's commandments. And that's what a lot of this poem is going to be about. So just want to establish these themes now. So the prologue continues to talk about sort of the blisses of heaven, and it also does a bit of foreshadowing as well for the rest of the story. So it says, they subdue those accursed spirits and obtain for them the repose of glory. Humanity's heart must climb into here before or after, when he attends his solitary and sublime spirit, so that these good souls will be allowed, clean of blot, to come into God's wielding. And we'll see this play out in the poem where Guthlac subdues and beats these various spirits, and eventually, because of his work, he gets to ascend into heaven. Immediately after, the poem says, there are throughout Middle Earth, and here, as in other Anglo-Saxon poetry and in Tolkien, I guess, Middle Earth, which is where he gets it from, Middle Earth just means Earth, and the term Middle Earth has a specific cosmological significance, right? So there is the heavens above, the middle, which is earth, and then down below we have hell. So it says, there are throughout Middle Earth many orders of men beneath the heavens, those who rise up in the reckoning of the holy. We can rightfully heed any one of them. If we wish to hold the holy commandments, the wise man now can take advantage of the opportunity of auspicious seasons, and his spirit can venture forth, desiring the way. The world is writhing, love for Christ cools, and many temptations have mounted throughout Middle Earth. Just as in former years, God's prophets have warned wordfully, and through their divination declared the sum just as it is happening now. All earthly abundance elders, and from their beauty fruiting things fade. In such tardy seasons, all seeds become weaker in virtue. So here we have both a pessimistic view about how people are no longer following God's law, love for Christ cools or wanes, you could say. However, there's also a sense of optimism because it says there are still these holy men who are kind of like the prophets of old, which we can follow. And here is where that wisdom literature motif comes in. It says that these are the people that we can follow. We can rightfully heed any one of them, it says. And then as the poem unfolds, it's going to give Guthlac to be an example, or at least one of the examples of which we can follow. The poem also at one point says Middle Earth is shared out into halves, and there's the half of those who follow God's law, and then there's the half who cling to earthwheel, or they cling to earthly pleasures, earthly possessions, earthly wealth over eternal life, and then it kind of compares how these two people live. It says, some dwell in desert places. They willingly seek out and occupy homes in the shadows. They await their dwelling among heaven's kind. Often one drives loathsome terror down upon them, he who would snatch away life. Sometimes he reveals terrifying thoughts to them, sometimes idle glories. The killer, wise in woven lies, has both skills, and persecutes the soul dweller. So it's saying that, the demons persecute those who seek after heaven. And then it goes on, before these men stand angels, armed with ghostly weapons. They are mindful of their well-being and keep the spirits of saints, who know their joy is with the Lord. These are battle-tested champions who serve the King, that one who never refuses recompense for those that endure in his love. So although there's all these temptations that come to the saints, we're also reminded that these saints also have these battle-tested champions, these angels with ghostly weapons. This is kind of like an Anglo-Saxon way, using these Anglo-Saxon cultural terms of describing guardian angels. And now the poem jumps into the story of St Guthlac, and it's very clear from like the spacing that, it talks about these holy people, and then it then starts talking about St Guthlac, meaning that, Guthlac is one of these holy people. So the poem talks a little bit about St. Guthlac's early life, and it says, and here it's kind of assuming that you know the backstory. So at the point in Guthlac's life, it's the point where, he's kind of in his war band fighting against the Welsh, and it says, "The time yet came for the judgment of God, when he gave an angel unto Guthlac's understanding, so that his thirst for sinning could be assuaged. The time was at hand, and two guardians kept watch over him. They battled over him, an angel of the Lord and a fearsome spectre. Their counsels could not be any less alike, which they bore on many sorties into his heart's reason." So he has like an angel on his left, which is kind of like this fearsome spectre, as this translation says, and then he has like a guardian angel on his right, kind of like in the Shepherd of Hermas, where that imagery is first elucidated. One of them, it says, said that all things of earth were fleeting in the wind, and praised the enduing good in the heavens, where the souls of the holy recline in victory's glory upon the joys of the Lord, who frankly doles out reward for their deeds, to those who would give thanks for his gifts, and who would utterly give up the world, then lose their life. The other, so now talking about the demon on his shoulder, the other incited him to seek by night the covens of reavers, and struggle over mortal goods by acts of malice, as do exiled warriors, who mourn not for men's souls who bring plunder to their hands, say that they may have spoil by them. So there's an interesting implication here. So it talks about how the demon tries to get him to act like an exiled warrior does. And by this, the poem is kind of implying that the demons, and we'll see this a lot later on here in a second, that the demons are the real exiled warriors. They're the real people who are permanently exiled, while if you're on earth, if you're a human and you can have a chance of salvation, your exile, in a sense, is only temporary because you have a permanent home in heaven. So back to the poem. "And so they exhorted Guthlac on either side, until the Lord of hosts reckoned the struggle's end in the angel's favor. The enemy was routed. Afterwards the comforting spirit was enshrined within Guthlac for his help, holding him dear and instructing him even more eagerly the longer the lesson went on, so that he came to cherish the land's joy, his home within the hill." So the first thing to note is that it says that God is in control. It says the Lord of hosts, which means God. He decided the struggle's end in the angel's favor. So, when it comes to these angels and demons, God is the one who's really in control. And unlike the Latin life, this poem doesn't really talk about his life in the monastery with other monastics. It kind of jumps straight into his hermetic life, where he goes to live on a home within the hill. And there's a little bit of controversy about this term hill. It can also mean barrow. And in this translation that I'm reading, it actually switches back and forth between the two words, just kind of depending on context. And there was a time in like the latter half of the 20th century where there was a couple people arguing about this word barrow or hill. It's like, which one does it really mean? But it's pretty obvious that it means both, or it could mean both at least. At the very least, it means hill. And this is like how these monastics, these hermits, they'll live on these little mountains of God, or they live on these elevated pieces of land, which they make into the mountain of God. Even in urban areas, like with the stylites, they get up on a high place, and then they're just in constant prayer and meditation. So it's rather fitting that Guthlac lives on a hill within the fens. But it could also be a burial mound as well, like because these burial mounds, they serve as these little hills, right? There's nothing wrong with it being both at the same time. There's no reason why those two things have to be contradictory whatsoever. Another interesting thing here is that it never uses the word fens to describe the land that he goes to. I think just earlier just used like the generic term for like wilderness. So again, it's kind of assuming that you have quite a bit of background knowledge about the life of St. Guthlac. But back to the story here. So Guthlac, goes to live a hermetic life in the wilderness on his little hill. But the poem jumps around temporally and notes that there was widespread reports about his wisdom, before the poem even talks about him subduing demons. So that's how kind of the poem jumps around a bit. So we learn that in the wilderness, God protects him, and he's surrounded by these angels who are also protecting him. But then we see the demons come. They're described actually as an infantry band, so in kind of these Anglo-Saxon terms again. And they tempt him by, first, they tell him to just go away. Just go away, go home, pursue human joys and family matters. And it's here that we learn why the demons are going to be tormenting Guthlac so much. So now, quoting the poem, the demons said that Guthlac alone, save God himself, had wreaked the most misery upon them, since he, overweening in the waste, had broken the barrows where they, wretched enemies, were once able to brook an abode after their torments, when they had come to rest, weary from wanderings, from the currents of time, and rejoice in the repose that was permitted them for some little while. St. Guthlac's existence in the wilderness is a existential threat to these demons. Just by him existing there, living as a holy man who prays and fasts and does these ascetical practices, it just annoys the demons who have made their home, away from human civilization, away from, people who pray, away from churches and stuff like that. But then you have Guthlac, who in a sense, he's kind of acting like a warrior for Christ. He's going out and he's reclaiming these no man's land, or these lands that are, occupied by these demons and these monsters. And he's reclaiming them for Christ. Immediately after what I just quoted, the poem goes on to say, that secret space stood high in the thoughts of the Lord. Though abandoned and man devoid, far from any land claims, it waited for the charter of a better guardian, for whom the elder foes harbored a hatred. So the way the poem talks about the land that Guthlac is on, this demon-infested wasteland, is in terms of Anglo-Saxon land claims. It's man devoid. There's no land claims there. It awaits a better charter, or awaits a charter rather. And so this is Christ expanding his territory through Guthlac. But then there's something else I want to point out, which I quoted earlier. So the way that the poem describes the demons, it says that they are weary from wanderings, from the currents of time, and rejoice in the repose that was permitted them for some little while. That idea that they were permitted for some little while, that's actually a reference to either the book of Enoch or the book of Jubilees, or both, right? So we have some of this Second Temple Jewish literature, like apocryphal literature, whatever you want to call it, influencing this poem. And this is not surprising, because in other Anglo-Saxon poetry, for instance, in Beowulf, there's a lot of Enochic references, and then we'll find some other Enochic references later on in this poem as well. So I just thought that was interesting and wanted to point that out. The other thing to note is that the demons are the ones who are described as the exiles. They're the ones who have to wander and don't really have any home. They're only permitted, they're only permitted a little while to stay where they are. But even that, with the incarnation of Christ, has come to an end, right? So if we remember from the Synoptic Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all have this one story about the demon or the demoniac of the Gadarenes. And in there, the demons who possess the man, they say to Christ, "Have you come to torment us before the time?" So the idea was that for a little while, these demons, these offspring, the spirits of the Nephilim, of the giants, some of them were allowed to roam the earth for a specific time and inadvertently do God's will. However, now that the final day has come, like the eighth day has come, the incarnation is, we have the incarnation of Christ and that revelation and Pentecost and all that. The day of judgment has come, and these demons, they were allowed a little while to roam the earth, but that time is up. And God is using these various saints, including Guthlac here, to finish, to bring about judgment, to, finish what was started a long time ago. Then the poem goes on to say that the demons were neither allowed to harm Guthlac's soul nor separate soul from body, so kill him with a painful blow. So again, we have this idea that God's really the one who's in charge of these demons. These demons might think that they're in control, but in reality, they're only allowed to exist to the extent that they do God's will. So then the demons keep coming at him with more and more temptations, with various means, such as at one time they're like, "Oh, don't you want food? Why are you fasting? You can go home and go eat your food." And at one point they even promise to serve him if he will leave his hill. And each time Guthlac gives a quite a lengthy retort, in a sort of like didactic manner, I guess you could say. Obviously, that's directed, in a sense, in the story, it's directed to the demons, but in reality, it's for the reader to learn something about how to live a holy life and how to trust in God. And within all these retorts that St. Guthlac provides to the demons, there's this constant refrain of how God is the one protecting Guthlac. So I'll just read a couple examples here. So this is Guthlac talking to the demons who just tried to tempt him. "You are scattered. Sin weighs upon you. You know not how to beseech the Lord of multitudes, nor humbly seek for mercy, even though he permitted it for you some little while, that you were allowed to possess power over me. You were willing to accept that with patience, but conducted me up angrily, so that I could see from the air the constructs all over this country. The radiant light of heaven was revealed to me, though I might have endured your fury. You set me in scorn because I suffered meekly the roaming regula and the wild hearts of young men in God's temples. By this you would make game of the praise of saints. You sought the inferior, and did not judge the better by their deeds, yet these acts shall not be kept secret." So the sainted soldier shouted out. He was a martyr for mankind, sundered from his sins, yet he must endure for his share of pain, though the Lord ruled over his torments. So again, the Lord has control over these things. Listen, that seems some wonder to men that Guthlac would further allow miserable demons to strike him with savage seizures, and that it happened yet. We see this theme of wisdom literature coming up again, right? It's extolling Guthlac as this person who endures these pains and these sufferings and these torments, but it says that because he has his hope in God, he's able to endure these things, and that ultimately, all the pain and evil in the world, God is in a sense using that, for our salvation. It's in a way you could say addressing the problem of evil or the problem of pain or whatever. So it's this poem isn't just a hagiography in the sense of just blatantly saying what the saint did and stuff like that. Rather, it's a bit more explicit on its nature as a didactic text. Despite all of these temptations that fail, all these torments they try to do against Guthlac to make him leave the wasteland, leave the desert, and to leave them alone, they fail. They don't get anywhere, right? So they have one last trick they try to pull up their sleeve. So I'll read here from the poem. "Nevertheless, fury swollen, the racked wrathfully brought him, the champion of glory, the holy host thane, to the doors of hell, where the doomed spirits of the sinful first seek entry after their death pangs, into that horrible house, the bottomless pit down below the cliff. They shook him, wickedly offering him battle, dread and hatred, and a savage journey, as is the custom of fiends, when they wish to betray the souls of the soothfast with sins and crafty tricks." So we'll note here that they don't actually take him to hell. They bring him, as it says, to the doors of hell. And then we'll see in this next stanza I'll read. "Grim-hearted, they began to harass God's warrior in his heart, affirming strongly that he must go into that terrible and grim place and go down humble to hell's citizens and there suffer in burning bonds. They desire to drag the miserable wretch into hopelessness among the angry words. The Creator's champion, it could not be so." So the demons have no real power to send Guthlac to hell. They can take him to the doors, to the gates, but they, basically what this poem is saying is that if Guthlac wants to go to hell, if they want to take him to hell, they essentially have to convince him to do it himself. And I'm sure you can draw out the soteriological implications of that, which is that, the demons don't bring us to hell. It's in a sense we ourselves bring ourselves to hell. Maybe the demons can help trick us, but ultimately it's we ourselves who do it. And Guthlac, he retorts against the demons, and he says, or the poem says, "Guthlac, the blessed man, gave answer to them in his spirit, with the power of God. Do so much if Christ the Lord, the light origin of life, will permit you, the wielder of hosts, to be able to lead his pledged pilgrim into that hateful flame. That deed would be in the power of the glory King, Christ the Savior, he that humiliated you and routed you into servitude under close confinement." So there's this term that the poem or the translators translate as pledged pilgrim. Really, what that word means is like a faithful companion, or it's also sometimes translated as a stranger who seeks protection in the land to which he has come. And interestingly, the word that it's used there is actually the word for Varangian, like as in a Varangian guard, or it's cognate with that word. But what Guthlac is saying to the demons here is that they have no real power. If God wants him to go to hell, then okay, God can do that, but the demons themselves can't. And in the poem, Guthlac goes on for quite some time to keep, kind of condemning the demons, lambasting them, calling them out for their sin and their hatred of humanity. I'll read the end of his little speech that Guthlac gives. So he says, "Now and forever it shall be so that you have damnation and welling flame, and no blessings at all. Nor need you believe, beshorn of glory, that you, sinful in the shade with guile tricks, can shove me into shame, nor drag me into the fire blaze down into this hell house, where a home for you has been created." And again, this is kind of a callback to the book of Enoch. "The darkness of everlasting night, strife without end and grim ghast killing. There you mourning must be dragged into death, while I will have the delight of joys among the angels, in that lofty realm of the stars, where is the lawful king, the succor and salvation for the race of heroes, their company and community." And then we get this new figure come into play. We get this messenger of the Lord. So then came a messenger of the Lord, holy from the heavens, who with his voice pronounced fear on a sublime sort for the miserable demons. He ordered them, so the demons, to immediately lead glory's champion, limb whole and unharmed from that rack trip, so that the dearest soul, prepared in God's protection, should journey unto joy. The press of fiends were trembling in their terror. The powerful being spoke, the Lord's precious thane, shining day bright. He held the soul of Guthlac in his power, the proud protector, rich in mighty deeds. He bound the servants of darkness into agonizing restraints, imposing hardship and earnestly commanding them. Let there be no break of bone, nor bloody wound, no welts on his body, nor one whit of injury, which you could do to harm him. Rather, you will place him whole where you grabbed him. He shall control the countryside. You may no longer defend that place against him. I am the judge. The Lord commanded me to utter at once that you will heal him of every injury with your own hands, and after be obedient to him in his own judgments. I must not conceal my countenance before the lot of you. I am the servant of the Maker. I am one of the 12 who he cherished, in his heart most faithful in the form of men. This messenger of the Lord, we learn, is one of the 12 who God cherished. So he's one of the 12 disciples. In fact, it's actually St. Bartholomew. Later on, the poem will reveal this, as well as the same thing or a similar thing happens in the Latin life of St. Guthlac. And it might seem kind of random that it's St. Bartholomew who's the one to rescue him from hell. Not really hell, but, from, right before the gates of hell. But if you read some of these pseudo-epigraphical texts about St. Bartholomew, for instance, there's the Questions of St. Bartholomew in the Book of Resurrection of Christ. There's a lot of harrowing of hell themes, like Bartholomew going into hell and seeing the harrowing of hell or participating in it to some extent. So there's these texts floating around connecting him with hell and liberating people from there. So it makes sense that Bartholomew shows up here to, in a sense, save Guthlac from hell, or at least from the gates of hell, you could say. So the demons are forced to place St. Guthlac back on his mound in the fens. And then we see that, as it says that he has now conquered these demons, we see that he now has a much different relationship with nature. And it should be noted, following our chiastic structure here, that we are now back at Middle Earth. So the poem says, "Victory triumphant, the builder returned to the barrow. Many species, the race of treefowl blessed him with insistent chirping, revealing the return of the blessed man in tokens. Often he held out food for them when they blew about his hands, hungry and greedily eager, exulting in his aid. So that mild heat parted himself from the joys of mankind, serving the Lord, and taking unto himself the joys of wild beasts, since rejecting those of the world." So you see this with some saints, like the most famous examples, like Saint Seraphim of Sarov in the Russian forest, hanging out with bears and stuff like that. And you see other saints as well who have this who in a sense they're able to bring back creation to what it was meant to, because they're such holy people that the creation around them also gets restored. And then the poem goes on to extol the virtues of St. Guthlac a bit more. Again, following that the wisdom literature theme, where it's kind of telling you how to live your life based off how Guthlac lived his life. And then it comes to the end, and we see his ascent into heaven. So I'll read here. And so was Guthlac's spirit carried into the high heavens, in the embraces of angels, conducting him lovingly before the face of his eternal judge. The reward was granted him, a seat in the skies where he might always exist, established in life and continued in calm forever. The child of God and his patient protector, the mighty Lord and holy herdsman, the warden of heaven's realm. So the souls of the soothfast may climb up into that perpetual home, the realm of the stars. Those who accomplish the glory king's lifelong lesson here, in words and works, and in their life season, earn eternal life on earth and a home on high. Those are the hostmen, chosen champions dear to Christ, bearing in their breast bright belief and holy hope. So we're now back at the beginning of the poem, because the poem starts out in heaven, and now at the very end we're also back in heaven. And we see a lot of the same imagery used at the beginning to describe like the bliss of heaven, and when a holy saint rises up into heaven. A lot of the same imagery is used both in the very beginning and the very end, and that's part of the reason why I'm so skeptical of these scholars who want to dispute the prologue, because the language used at the end and at the beginning of the poem correlates so well with each other that it would be very weird to see it as just a coincidence. But I want to continue a bit more with this poem before they wrap up. So it continues, with clean hearts they, so like the saints going into heaven, worthy the wielder, holding thought both prompt and prudent unto the fourth way, to their father's homeland. So here we have this idea of exile, returning back to the father, returning from exile, finding a home. The ready soul's house, expertly overfighting the enemy and eschewing sinful desires in their own breast. These men attend to brotherly love eagerly. In God's purpose they trouble themselves, adorning their souls with holy thoughts. The command of the heaven king they affect on earth. They love fasting. They are sheltered from baleful evil and strive after their prayers. They struggle against sins and keep truth and right. Their hence going will never grieve them after. When they voyage to that holy city, departing directly for Jerusalem, where they may joyfully behold the face of God and her peace, and panorama unto the world's end, where she truly abides, beautiful and glory fast, for the entire width of life, in the delight of the land of the living. And that's the end. I hope everyone enjoyed and was able to get something out of this, not just from a, interesting historical lens, but also possibly from even a spiritual lens as well. So thank you everyone for listening.